I've spent the past few years seeking out people who are gripped by a sense of moral urgency. People who believe that living a decent life requires a lot from them. I met a nurse who spent 20 years working in a remote Nicaraguan village where no other nurse would go because it was too dangerous. I met a woman who donated one of her kidneys to save the life of a stranger. And I discovered that they're not some strange, otherworldly species of saint, but people just like us, except, of course, that they've chosen to live their lives very differently. And I wondered why. Not why aren't they more like us, but why aren't we more like them? In other words, why don't the rest of us, myself very much included, give more than we do? Now, I'm not preaching here. This is something I find genuinely difficult to understand. Because as we all know, giving makes you feel good. Giving something away often makes you happier than keeping it. So even if you believe, which I don't, that humans are innately selfish, it still doesn't make sense that we don't give more. So why don't we? I've been wondering about this question for quite some time, but of course when a question has the potential to change your whole life, you tend to put it off for as long as possible. But a few years ago, I decided to try. So the usual answer is we're human, we're selfish, we're lazy, we like our stuff too much to give it up. And of course all that's true. But I don't believe it's the whole story. Another part of the story is that the need of the world seems infinite, and so to open your mind to it can feel overwhelming. It can seem as though to live an ambitiously good life would take a frightening amount of sacrifice and involve high odds of failure. And what is a good life, anyway? We can probably agree that most of us should do more, but how much should we do? If you're the sort of person who's committed yourself to helping others, this actually becomes a very difficult but very important question to answer. Because it's not just a matter of giving up cappuccinos or extra pairs of shoes, but things that are far more precious, like certain kinds of beauty, certain kinds of freedom. And if you're truly committed to helping strangers, you're not going to be able to give everything you want to your family. But is it right to give to strangers at the expense of your own people? I felt I couldn't answer these questions in the abstract, which is why I went looking for people who've built their lives around moral commitment. I'll give you an example. Sue and Hector Badeau were high school sweethearts in Vermont. And Sue had always wanted to adopt when she grew up. She thought it would be so much fun to bring in kids who needed a family and love them and make them happy. And so when she and Hector decided to get married, they decided to have 2 kids and adopt 2. And they did. But then they got involved in the adoption world, and they discovered how many children there are who are unlikely ever to be adopted, either because they're too old, or too sick, or the wrong race, or they have too many brothers and sisters. And when Sue and Hector thought about all those children who were likely to spend their childhoods going from foster home to foster home to foster home, never having a family at all, they could not bear it. And so they started to adopt more and more and more. And they ended up adopting 20 of these special needs children in addition to the 2 biological kids they had. And at first it was really fun. They had this big multiracial brood of children, and the children were always excited to have new kids to play with. But of course it wasn't always so easy. There were so many hard times. As you can imagine, Sue and Hector always emphasized to their children the importance of having a stable home before you had children, so that you could raise them properly. But one after the other, every single one of their girls got accidentally pregnant. When the last girl told them she was pregnant, Hector started to cry. He left the house, and he got on a train, and he just rode that train up and down the line all day, crying most of the way. And as the family grew larger, and they started asking the older kids to help take care of the younger kids, they started to complain. They said, "Mom and Dad, we cannot adopt all the children in the world. You have to stop. We don't get enough of your time and attention as it is." Now, I think for most ordinary parents, that would be the end of it. It's making my kids unhappy, I'm going to stop. And this hurt Sue and Hector very deeply, too, because I want to emphasize this was a real family. This was not an orphanage. and they loved their children as much as any parents do. But, and this is what makes them different, they could not stop thinking about that child out there, the child who was still a stranger to them, but who would not have a family unless they took him in. And they thought, even if it makes our children a little less happy, if it dramatically changes the life of that child, then it's worth it. And it was worth it. They held their family together through the hard times, and now that their children are grown, they have children and grandchildren of their own, and most of them still live within a few blocks of Sue and Hector's house, and they're in and out of each other's houses all the time, taking care of each other's kids, and every holiday, the family gathers and has a meal together. Now, this conflict between family and strangers was probably the deepest and most difficult conflict for everyone I spoke to. But it took different forms. I'll give you another example. Baba Amte was born into an aristocratic Indian family, and he was a very macho guy. He was always fighting, he was very brave. This was central to his image of himself. And one day he was walking along the road when he saw, in the rain, when he saw a leper lying there at the side of the road, and it was a man in the last stages of the disease. His eyes caved in, his flesh decayed and crawling with maggots. And Baba was horrified by this sight and afraid of catching the disease, so he ran. And then he realized that he, Baba Amte, had run in fear. He had been a coward, and he could not tolerate this thought, so he forced himself to go back. And there wasn't that much he could do for the man. He was near death, but he covered him with a blanket to protect him from the rain, and he decided the only way he could really restore his sense of himself was to steer directly into this fear, and he would make leprosy his life's work. The first thing he did was enroll in a school of tropical medicine, and he discovered that one of the reasons there was as yet no cure for leprosy was that it seemed to be impossible to transmit the disease to animals for the purpose of experiments. He thought about this for a day, and then he offered himself as a human experimental subject. And he was injected with the leprosy bacillus, but he didn't catch the disease. As it happened, shortly after he graduated from the school, there was a cure found, the drug dapsone. But then, as now, there are many, many people in India who can't afford to go to a doctor, or if they do go to a doctor, they wait until they're absolutely desperate. And the symptoms of leprosy were so terrifying to people and so unmistakable that even once a cure had been found, leprosy patients had many of the same problems they'd had before. They were thrown out of their families, thrown out of their villages, forced to beg, sometimes even burned alive. And so even after a cure had been found, leprosy colonies were still necessary, and Baba decided to found one. He was given a tract of land by the state, a total wilderness, and he moved out there with several leprosy patients, his wife, their 2 baby sons, and 4 dogs to protect them from the wild animals, because at first there was nothing there at all, no water, nothing, and they were living in shelters that had no walls. And one by one, every single one of the dogs was carried off and eaten by a panther. Now, I visited this leprosy colony many decades later after he founded it, and it's now a flourishing community. It's an extraordinary place. Several thousand people live there, and this is not just a refuge for the desperate anymore. It's a place where people live their whole lives, they have children, they get married, there are many schools there are workshops, there's even a college. But this is what I mean when I talk about preparedness to sacrifice family for strangers. Baba's 2 baby sons were not carried off and eaten by a panther as the dogs were, but they might have been. And they did not catch leprosy, but they might have done. So this willingness to sacrifice family for strangers, for a cause, many people find it strange and unnatural. There's a philosopher, the late Bernard Williams, who has a thought experiment about this. He says, imagine a man standing on a beach, and his wife is drowning over there, and 2 strangers are drowning over there, and he can only save one or the other. And he stands there and he thinks, is it morally permissible for me to save my wife? This man, Bernard Williams said, is having one thought too many. And probably when he saves his wife, he should not tell her about his difficult moral dilemma. Now, it might seem like Williams is obviously right about this, but actually it is not so simple. because your wife, your child, your mother versus one stranger or two strangers, that might seem pretty easy. But what if it's 10 strangers, or 100, or 1,000,000? At a certain point, you're going to start to feel guilty. And in fact, everyone has a number, and so they should. Because this is not just a hypothetical philosophical example, but a situation that actually arises during wartime. And in wartime, many moral questions tend to look quite different. In wartime, it's thought to be your duty, rather than unnatural, to leave your family behind for the sake of a larger cause. In ordinary times, to ask a person to sacrifice himself for a stranger would seem outrageous. But in war, it's commonplace. And I think one of the reasons that these very moral people can seem strange to us now is that although we have lived during wartime, war no longer requires sacrifice of all of us. It's been a very long time in this country since we've had conscription for a war that most people considered to be both just and necessary, which is to say World War II. And so there's almost no one left alive here who has had the experience of it being completely ordinary and expected of everyone to sacrifice a father, a brother, a son for a larger cause. And in the absence of this more public form of duty, it seems to me that the sense of duty to family has expanded to take its place, so that now people who are prepared to sacrifice family for a larger cause, for strangers, seem unnatural and extreme. And it's this sense that sacrifice of family for cause is unnatural and extreme that I think is a deeper reason why some of us don't give more than we do. It's not just selfishness, though that's definitely part of it. But there is also in many of us a genuine moral conflict about what matters most in life and what is the best way to live. People would ask Sue and Hector why they'd chosen to live the way they did. Why did they adopt one or two kids? Why didn't they just adopt one or two kids and live an easier, more normal life? And what they didn't understand, those people, is that Sue and Hector never wanted an easy life. They didn't just love their children. They loved the challenge. They didn't just love their life in spite of its difficulties, but in part because of them. And this is another difference between people like Sue and Hector and Baba Amte and the rest of us. For them, it is always wartime. By that I mean that they know, not just intellectually, but vividly and urgently, that there is always, somewhere, a need for help. And they feel that even though the people who need the help may be strangers to them, they are also, in some sense, their people. The thing about Sue and Hector and Baba Amte is that they have a deep and happy sense of purpose. Of course, they have sacrificed many comforts, but in exchange, they know that they have changed many lives for the better. And they feel, they believe, that they are living their own lives the way they ought to. And how many of us can say that? Thank you.